You are listening because you want to understand something difficult. Not out of curiosity for darkness, but out of a quiet need to make sense of it. You've felt that tension before. The way certain stories lodge themselves in your chest and refuse to leave. The headlines, the courtroom sketches, the conversations that stop short because no one knows what to say next. You are here because you sense that understanding is not the same as excusing, and that looking closely at something frightening is often the first step toward preventing it. So you sit with this, you let yourself slow down, you let the noise fade, and you look at the question most people avoid asking out loud. What is actually happening, psychologically, when someone exerts sexual violence? You already know what it is not. It is not about uncontrollable desire. It is not about attraction. It is not about passion that went too far. Psychologists have been clear about this for decades, even if culture keeps getting it wrong. Sexual violence is not driven by sex. It is driven by power, entitlement, and control. When you hear that, something clicks, because power has a very different emotional texture than desire. Power is colder, more deliberate. It has weight to it. It carries the belief that another person's boundaries are negotiable, optional, or irrelevant. Research consistently shows that people who commit sexual violence are not overwhelmed by feeling. They're often disconnected from it. They're not losing control, they are exerting it. You think about how often language disguises this truth. He couldn't help himself. It just happened. Things got out of hand. These phrases soften something that is, at its core, intentional. Studies in forensic psychology suggest that many perpetrators carefully test boundaries long before an assault occurs. They watch reactions. They push slightly, then slightly more. They rely on confusion, silence, or social pressure. This is not chaos. This is pattern. And patterns always come from somewhere. You begin to notice that sexual violence often grows in the same soil as other forms of domination, in environments where empathy is undervalued, where masculinity is defined by conquest, where vulnerability is mocked, where entitlement is quietly rewarded. Social psychologists talk about hostile masculinity, a cluster of traits that include distrust of others, insecurity masked as arrogance, and the belief that status must be taken rather than earned. Not everyone exposed to these ideas becomes violent, of course, but these ideas create permission structures. They whisper that some people matter more than others. You realize that for many perpetrators, intimacy itself feels threatening. Real intimacy requires mutuality. It requires recognizing another person as fully human, with an inner life as rich and fragile as your own. For someone deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability, that recognition can feel unbearable. Control becomes a substitute for connection. Power becomes a stand-in for closeness. Attachment research helps explain this. Studies suggest that individuals with avoidant or disorganized attachment styles, often shaped by early experiences of neglect, inconsistency, or fear, may struggle to regulate emotion or tolerate dependence. Instead of learning how to sit with longing, rejection, or uncertainty, they learn how to bypass those feelings. Sexual violence becomes a way to override the discomfort of not being chosen, not being wanted, not being in control. This doesn't make it inevitable. It makes it understandable in a precise clinical sense. Explanation is not absolution. Understanding the mechanics of a fire does not mean you excuse the damage it causes, but it does mean you know where to intervene. You think about empathy next, not the shallow kind that gets confused with kindness, but the cognitive ability to recognize another person's emotional reality. Research shows that many perpetrators display empathy deficits, not always because they cannot understand emotions, but because they selectively disengage from them. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. It's the mental process of turning a person into an object, a role, a story that makes harm feel justified or invisible. She wanted it. They didn't say no. It wasn't that bad. These are not misunderstandings. They are psychological shields. They protect the self-image at all costs, because underneath entitlement often lives shame, unexamined, buried, and volatile. Rather than face that shame, it gets projected outward. Blame becomes external. Responsibility dissolves. You notice how often sexual violence is followed by denial, minimization, or outrage at consequences rather than remorse. This aligns with what research shows. Accountability threatens the fragile identity that has been built on dominance. To accept responsibility would require dismantling the very structure that holds the self together. You also begin to see how alcohol and substances are misused in these narratives. While intoxication can lower inhibitions, studies consistently show it does not create violent intent, it reveals it. Alcohol becomes another excuse society accepts too easily, another way to avoid confronting the underlying belief system that made harm possible. And then there's the myth of the monster, the idea that perpetrators are fundamentally different from everyone else, inhuman, easily identifiable. This myth is comforting because it suggests safety through distance, but psychology complicates that comfort. Many people who commit sexual violence are not outsiders. They are coworkers, friends, partners, people who function in daily life. That ordinariness is precisely why prevention is difficult and why understanding matters. You feel the weight of that realization because it means the problem is not just individual pathology. It is cultural. It is relational. It lives in what gets laughed off, what gets excused, what gets normalized. It lives in silence. You think about how early some of these patterns begin, how children learn about consent not through formal lessons, but through what is modeled, through whether their no is respected, through whether power is exercised with care or domination. Developmental psychology suggests that when children learn their boundaries don't matter, or that asserting them leads to punishment or ridicule, those lessons echo forward. Again, not as destiny, but as risk. What strikes you most is how preventable so much of this is, not through fear-based messaging or moral panic, but through emotional literacy. Through teaching people how to tolerate rejection without collapsing, how to experience desire without entitlement, how to sit with discomfort without turning it into harm. You realize that sexual violence is not a failure of impulse control. It is a failure of relational skill, a failure to recognize another person as an equal participant in a shared human moment. And that recognition can be taught, practiced, reinforced. As you sit with all of this, something subtle shifts. The topic no longer feels abstract. It feels grounded, real. You understand now why psychologists insist on precise language, why they correct the myths, why they push back against narratives that frame harm as accidental or uncontrollable. Because accuracy is not cold, it is protective. And then, quietly, another realization emerges. Understanding the psychology is not just about identifying perpetrators. It's about recognizing the conditions that allow harm to happen and choosing, collectively and individually, to disrupt them. It's about noticing how power moves in everyday interactions, how consent is spoken or ignored, how empathy is practiced or withheld. You think about the role of bystanders. Research shows that communities with strong bystander intervention norms see lower rates of sexual violence, not because people are better, but because silence is no longer guaranteed. Accountability becomes shared. This is where the story turns inward, not toward blame, but toward responsibility. You are not being asked to carry guilt for harm you did not commit. You are being invited into clarity, to understand that preventing sexual violence is not about hunting monsters. It's about dismantling myths, strengthening boundaries, and refusing to look away when something feels off. You recognize the quiet power in that, the power of naming things accurately, of resisting narratives that soften harm, of believing survivors without demanding perfection, and of understanding that justice and compassion are not opposites, they are partners. By the time you reach the end of this reflection, you feel steadier, not comforted in a shallow way, but grounded. You see that understanding the psychology of sexual violence does not pull you toward darkness, it equips you to interrupt it. Knowledge becomes a form of care. Attention becomes a form of resistance. You carry this with you now, in conversations, in the way you listen, in the way you notice power dynamics others overlook. You don't need to announce it. This understanding works quietly. It sharpens your instincts. It strengthens your resolve. And maybe that's the most important realization of all, that facing difficult truths does not make you cynical. It makes you capable. Capable of seeing clearly. Capable of protecting what matters. Capable of choosing empathy without surrendering accountability. You're not looking away anymore. And that, in itself, is a form of strength.